I stood in the lawyer's office, staring at the document my mother had just signed, a quitclaim deed transferring her entire estate to my younger brother, Derek. $240,000. The house she'd lived in for 32 years. Her retirement savings. Everything. And I got nothing. Not a penny. Not even a note explaining why. The notary stamped the papers with a finality that made my chest tighten. My mother looked at me from across the desk, her expression blank, almost defiant. She didn't say a word. She just stood up, walked past me without making eye contact, and left the office. That was the moment I realized my mother had chosen to erase me from her life. What I didn't know then was that this wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning of a nightmare that would last exactly 1 year. Let me back up. 3 years earlier, everything was different. I was 38 years old, living in a modest but comfortable split level in suburban Ohio with my wife, Jennifer, and our 2 kids, Emma and Lucas. My name is Michael, and I'd spent the last 15 years working my way up at a manufacturing company. I wasn't rich, but I was stable. I had a 401k that was growing steadily, a mortgage I could actually afford, and a wife who loved me. Life wasn't flashy, but it was good. It was ours. My mother, Linda, lived about 20 minutes away in the same town. We'd see her maybe twice a month, holidays, birthdays, the occasional Sunday dinner. She was a former nurse, independent to a fault, proud of the fact that she'd raised 2 sons after my father died when Derek and I were kids. Derek was 5 years younger than me, and we'd never been particularly close. He'd always been the charming one, the one who made people laugh, the one who seemed to effortlessly glide through life while I had to work for everything I got. My relationship with my mother was solid, but not overly warm. She was the kind of woman who showed love through action rather than words. She'd call to ask if we needed anything. She'd bring over casseroles after Emma was born. She'd help Jennifer with the kids when I was working late. It was steady, predictable, safe. We didn't talk about deep things. We didn't hug for a long time, but there was respect there. Or at least, I thought there was. Then my mother met Richard. Richard showed up at a family dinner in early spring about 3 years ago. He was a real estate investor, divorced, in his late 60s, with the kind of tan that suggested he spent more time on golf courses than anywhere else. He wore expensive cologne and had the habit of interrupting people mid-sentence. My wife, Jennifer, immediately pulled me aside and whispered, "Your mom seems really into this guy." I shrugged it off. My mother deserved companionship. She'd been alone for a long time. What I didn't know was that Richard had already started moving into her house. By summer, it was clear that Richard wasn't going anywhere. He'd furnished the guest bedroom with his belongings. He'd rearranged the kitchen. He was making decisions about the property, talking about updating the roof, refinancing the mortgage, maximizing her assets. My mother, who'd always been fiercely independent, suddenly seemed to defer to his opinions. When I'd suggest something, she'd say, "Richard thinks we should wait," or "Richard says that's not a good investment." Jennifer noticed it too. "That's not healthy," she said one night after we'd had them over for dinner. "Your mom's letting him run her life." "She's an adult," I replied. But even as I said it, I felt uneasy. There was something about the speed of it all, the way Richard had inserted himself into every corner of her existence. But what was I supposed to do? Tell my mother who she could or couldn't see? By fall, my mother had moved Richard into her bedroom. By winter, she was talking about the possibility of marriage. Derek thought it was wonderful. "She's happy," he'd say whenever I expressed concern. "Let her be happy." Derek was living in Denver by then, working in tech, making good money, rarely visiting. It was easy for him to be supported from 2,000 miles away. The first real sign that something was wrong came in January, about 2 years before that lawyer's office moment. My mother called me and asked if I could come over to help her with some paperwork. When I arrived, Richard answered the door. My mother was sitting at the dining room table with a stack of documents in front of her. Richard stood behind her chair like a gatekeeper. "Michael, thank goodness you're here," my mother said. "I need to update some things."
Richard thinks it would be smart to put him on the house deed, for protection, in case something happens to me. I felt something cold slide down my spine. "What do you mean, put him on the deed?" "Just as a precaution," Richard interjected smoothly, placing a hand on my mother's shoulder. The gesture made my skin crawl. "I want to make sure Linda is protected. If anything happens to her, I want to be able to take care of things without legal complications." "You can do that with a power of attorney," I said carefully. "You don't need to be on the deed." My mother looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before, something between annoyance and embarrassment. "Richard knows about these things, Michael. He's done this before." "Of course he has," I muttered, but I didn't push it further. I was still thinking of her as my mother, as someone who needed my protection. I didn't yet understand that she'd already made her choice. That night, I called Jennifer and told her what happened. "You need to talk to her," Jennifer said. "You need to tell her that this guy is taking advantage of her." But I didn't. I told myself I was respecting her autonomy. I told myself it wasn't my place to interfere. The truth was, I was afraid of losing her. I was afraid that if I pushed too hard, she'd push back harder, and I'd end up with nothing anyway. By spring, Richard had indeed been added to the deed. By summer, he'd convinced my mother to refinance the house and use the equity to fund some investment opportunity that he swore would double her money in 5 years. By fall, I'd stopped calling as much. Every conversation felt tense. Every time I tried to express concern, my mother would defend Richard. Every time I suggested she was making a mistake, she'd accuse me of being jealous or unsupportive. The distance grew. It was subtle at first, then impossible to ignore. Then came the phone call that changed everything. It was a Tuesday evening in late November, almost exactly a year before I'd find myself in that lawyer's office. I was sitting in my home office, reviewing a budget spreadsheet for work, when my phone rang. It was Derek, calling from Denver. "Hey man, I need to give you a heads up," he said without preamble. "Mom called me today. She's planning to change her will." My heart started pounding. "What do you mean, change her will? She's going to leave everything to Richard, or maybe set up some kind of trust for him. I don't know the details. But she wanted to tell me before she did it, and she asked me not to tell you." I couldn't speak for a moment. My younger brother was calling to warn me that our mother had decided to leave me nothing, and she'd asked him not to tell me. "Did she say why?" I finally managed. "She said she felt like you'd been distant, that you didn't approve of Richard, that since you clearly didn't want to be part of her life anymore, she didn't see why she should leave you anything." The words landed like physical blows. I'd been distant? I'd been distant because she was being manipulated by a con artist. I'd been distant because I was trying to protect her, and she'd interpreted that as judgment. "Derek, listen to me," I said, my voice steady despite the panic rising in my chest. "Richard is scamming her. I don't want to get involved," Derek interrupted. "That's between you and Mom. I'm just giving you the courtesy of a heads up." He hung up. I sat in the dark of my office, the spreadsheet forgotten, and tried to process what had just happened. My mother was going to cut me out of her will. My mother, who had raised me, who had been my parent, who had been a constant, if distant, presence in my life. She was going to give everything to a man she'd known for 2 years. I called her immediately. She picked up on the third ring. I could hear Richard in the background asking who was calling. "It's Michael," I heard her say, and there was an edge of irritation in her voice. "Mom, Derek just told me about the will," I said, trying to keep my voice level. "We need to talk about this." "There's nothing to talk about," she replied coldly. "It's my money, my house, my decision." "I know it's your decision, but, Mom, Richard is—" "Don't," she cut me off sharply. "Don't you dare say anything negative about Richard. He's been nothing but kind to me. He's been more supportive than you have." "I'm trying to protect you,"
I said, and I could hear the desperation creeping into my voice. I don't need your protection, Michael. I need your respect. And clearly, I don't have that. There was a pause.
I could hear Richard saying something to her, his voice low and soothing. "Mom?" "I have to go," she said. "Richard and I are going to dinner." And she hung up. I sat in the darkness of my office for a long time after that, listening to the sound of my own breathing, understanding with absolute clarity that I was about to lose my mother. Not to death, but to something worse, to erasure, to irrelevance. I didn't know that in exactly 1 year, that understanding would become a legal reality. I didn't know that my mother would sit across from me in a lawyer's office and sign away my inheritance to a man she'd known for less time than she'd known me. All I knew in that moment was that something fundamental had shifted. The solid ground of my life had begun to crack, and I had no idea how far the fractures would spread. The year that followed was the longest year of my life. I didn't confront my mother again after that phone call. I told myself it was a choice, that I was taking the high road, respecting her autonomy, being the mature one. The truth was simpler and uglier. I was scared. I was scared that if I pushed, she'd push back harder. I was scared that my worst fears would be confirmed in writing, stamped and notarized. So I retreated into silence, and the silence became a wall between us. Jennifer noticed immediately. "You need to talk to her," she said that first week. By week 3, she'd stopped asking. By month 2, she'd stopped mentioning it altogether, though I'd catch her watching me with an expression that was half pity, half frustration. My wife had always been the stronger one, the one who didn't let things fester. But even she seemed to understand that some wounds needed time before they could be addressed. I threw myself into work. I picked up extra shifts, volunteered for projects that would keep me at the office until 8 or 9 at night. Emma started asking why Daddy wasn't home for dinner. Lucas, only 6, seemed to think it was normal that I'd tuck him in after he was already asleep. Jennifer didn't complain, but I could see the exhaustion in the way she moved, the tightness around her eyes. Christmas came. My mother called the house in early December. Jennifer answered. I heard her say, "Michael's not home right now," and then a pause, and then something that made my wife's jaw clench. She handed me the phone without a word. "Michael," my mother said when I picked up. Her voice was different, formal, like she was reading from a script. "Richard and I are getting married. We're having a small ceremony on December 23rd. Just family. I'd like you to come." I couldn't speak. My mother was marrying a man I was convinced was a con artist, a man who had systematically isolated her and was liquidating her assets. And she was inviting me to celebrate it? "I don't think I can make it," I finally said. There was a long silence. "Richard thought you might say that." Of course he did. Richard always knew what I would say before I said it. "Michael, I'm 68 years old. I'm allowed to make my own choices." "I know you are." "Then why can't you just be happy for me?" "Because I'm terrified," I wanted to say. "Because I'm watching you disappear into someone else's version of your life. Because I'm losing you and I don't know how to stop it." "I am happy for you," I lied. I'm not sure I can be there." She hung up without saying goodbye. Derek didn't go to the wedding either, though for different reasons. He called me afterward to report that it had been a small affair at a country club. Just the two of them, Richard's ex-wife and her new husband, awkward, and a couple of Richard's business associates. My mother had worn a cream-colored dress. She looked beautiful, Derek said. Happy. That should have been when everything came to a head. That should have been the moment when I finally confronted her, when I finally tried to protect her from what I was increasingly certain was happening. But I didn't. Instead, I did nothing, and the nothing became its own kind of action. By spring, Richard had moved my mother's retirement savings into a joint investment account.
By summer, he'd convinced her to take out a second mortgage. By fall, I'd found out, not from my mother, but from Derek, who'd finally started paying attention, that my mother had changed her will. Derek didn't know the exact terms, but he knew it involved Richard. Then came that Tuesday evening when Derek called with the warning, and the phone call to my mother, and her cold rejection. I spent the next 3 months in a state of suspended animation. I went to work. I came home. I was present but absent, a ghost haunting my own life. Jennifer tried to reach me. She'd suggest we go out, just the two of us. She'd bring me coffee in my office, sit on the edge of the desk, and ask me about my day. I'd give her one-word answers. I was drowning, and I couldn't figure out how to tell her without admitting that I'd been stupid enough to let this happen, that I'd been passive enough to let a man I'd never trusted worm his way into my family and destroy it. By November, exactly 1 year after Derek's warning call, I was sitting in that lawyer's office, watching my mother sign away everything to a man who'd been in her life for less than 3 years. The notary's stamp was the loudest sound I'd ever heard. After that, things moved very quickly. I drove straight to my brother's house. Derek was in town for Thanksgiving, which meant he was actually available for once. When I showed up at his rental house in downtown Cleveland, soaking wet from the November rain, he took one look at my face and didn't ask any questions. He just poured me a drink. "She did it," I said. "She signed everything over to him." Derek set down his own glass. Everything? The house. Her savings. All of it. $240,000, Derek. That's what she was worth. And now it belongs to a man who... I stopped. I couldn't finish the sentence without screaming. "Okay," Derek said, and his tone had changed. He sounded like the little brother I remembered, the one who used to follow me around the house, asking if I wanted to play catch. "Okay, we need to find out what's really going on." Over the next 2 weeks, Derek and I did something we'd never done before. We worked together. Derek had money from his tech job, and more importantly, he had connections. He hired a private investigator to look into Richard's background. What came back was damning. Richard's real name was Richard Charles Mitchell. He'd been married 3 times before, each marriage ending with a significant transfer of assets to him. His second wife had eventually gotten a lawyer involved and recovered some of her money, but not before she'd lost her house. His third wife had simply disappeared from his life, leaving behind a trail of legal disputes. There was no record of his supposed real estate investments. His business was a shell. But what was real, what was documented and verifiable, was that he'd been sued twice for financial elder abuse in 2 different states. "He's done this before," the investigator told us, sitting in a nondescript office on the east side of Cleveland. "Same pattern every time. Isolated older woman with money, moves in, slowly takes control of finances, pressure them to change their will or transfer assets, then..." "Then what?" I asked, though I already knew. "Then they disappear. Takes the money and moves to the next state. Sometimes there's litigation, but by then the money's gone." I felt something shift in my chest. For a year, I'd blamed myself. I'd convinced myself that I'd been passive, that I should have done more, that I'd failed my mother by not being forceful enough. Now I understood the truth. My mother had been the victim of a predator, and I'd been so caught up in my own resentment at being cut out of the will that I'd missed the most important thing. She needed help. "We can fight this," Derek said on the drive back to his house. "The will, the deed, all of it, if we can prove undue influence." "How?" I asked. "She's of sound mind. She can sign away whatever she wants. Not if she's being coerced or manipulated. That's elder abuse. That's illegal." I wanted to believe him, but I also knew my mother. Even if we could prove that Richard was a con artist, would she believe us? Or would she just dig in harder, convinced that we were trying to steal from her? We decided to try anyway. Derek's lawyer, an aggressive woman named Patricia who specialized in elder law, sent a letter to Richard demanding financial records and an accounting of all transactions involving my mother's assets. Richard's response came through his own attorney 3 days later. He would not be providing any records, and if we attempted to interfere with his marriage or his legal right to manage joint assets, he would pursue a restraining order against us for harassment. The threat should have terrified me. Instead, it made me angry. Not the hot, impulsive anger I'd felt a year ago, but something colder and more focused. "He's panicking," Patricia said when we reviewed the letter. "This response tells me he knows we can prove something. An innocent person wouldn't threaten legal action. They'd welcome the scrutiny." "So what do?" I asked.
We file for a conservatorship review. We petition the court to have your mother evaluated by a geriatric psychiatrist. If we can establish that she lacks capacity to manage her own affairs due to undue influence or manipulation, we can get the court to appoint a conservator, possibly you, to manage her finances.
"That sounds like we're trying to declare her incompetent," Derek said.
"In a way, we are," Patricia replied. "But legally, it's about her capacity to make informed decisions. And based on what we know about Richard's history, I think we have a case."
The petition was filed in December. The court ordered an evaluation for January. My mother's attorney, Richard's choice, naturally, immediately filed a countermotion to dismiss. The legal documents started piling up like snow, each one cold and official and final. I didn't tell my mother what we were doing. I told myself it was strategic, that surprising her would be better than giving her time to prepare. The truth was that I couldn't face another conversation with her where I explained why I was doing this. I couldn't bear to see her defend Richard one more time, to watch her choose him over me again.
The night before the evaluation, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed next to Jennifer, staring at the ceiling, thinking about all the ways this could go wrong. My mother could refuse to cooperate. She could be so defensive that the psychiatrist concluded she was fine. Richard could convince her that we were the bad guys. We could lose everything we were fighting for.
"You're doing the right thing," Jennifer whispered into the darkness. "You know that, right?" "I don't know anything anymore," I said. The evaluation was conducted at a neutral location, a clinic downtown, clinical and sterile. The psychiatrist, Dr. Amanda Chen, spent 3 hours with my mother, administering tests, asking questions, building a psychological profile. Afterward, she spent an hour with me and Derek, asking us about my mother's behavior, about when the changes started, about Richard. "Your mother is cognitively intact," Dr. Chen said at the end of that conversation. "Her memory is sharp. She understands the implications of her financial decisions. But, I leaned forward. But she exhibits signs of emotional dependence and susceptibility to suggestion.
Combined with a documented pattern of this man's behavior in other states, I would say there is significant evidence of undue influence. She's not incompetent. She's been manipulated by someone who is extremely skilled at manipulation." It was the first piece of good news I'd heard in a year. The court date was set for late January. We had 3 weeks to prepare our case. Patricia compiled everything: the investigator's report, Richard's history in other states, the timeline of my mother's financial decisions, expert testimony about the psychological tactics used in elder abuse. She built a fortress of evidence. The night before the hearing, I drove past my mother's house. The lights were on. I could see her silhouette moving through the living room. I wondered if she had any idea what was coming. I wondered if Richard had told her, or if he'd kept it from her. Convinced her that we were crazy, that we were trying to destroy their life together. I almost drove up to the door. I almost got out of the car and knocked and tried one more time to explain. But I didn't. I sat there in the driveway for 10 minutes, watching my mother's life through a window, and then I drove away. The courtroom was smaller than I expected. It smelled like old wood and older carpet. My mother sat on one side of the room with Richard and their attorney. Derek sat next to me. Patricia was in front of us, organizing her notes with the precision of someone who'd done this 1,000 times.
The judge, an older man named Morrison, with gray hair and the expression of someone who'd seen every variation of human cruelty, called the case. Patricia presented her evidence methodically, building the case brick by brick. She showed the investigator's report. She played the recording of the geriatric psychiatrist's testimony. She presented the timeline of my mother's financial decisions, showing how they escalated in frequency and severity after Richard entered her life. Then, Richard's attorney stood up and essentially argued that my mother was an adult capable of making her own decisions, that loving someone and wanting to provide for them wasn't a crime, and that my brother and I were bitter about being left out of the will.
Your Honor, he said, this case is really about two sons who are angry that their mother chose to spend her later years with the man she loves rather than depend on them. That's not elder abuse. That's just family conflict. I felt rage ignite in my chest. I wanted to stand up and scream at him that he didn't know anything about my relationship with my mother, that I'd never asked her for money or expected anything from her, that the only thing I'd ever wanted was for her to be safe. But I stayed silent. Then Judge Morrison asked to hear from my mother. She stood up slowly, and I was shocked by how small she looked. When had she gotten so small? She'd always been a strong woman, broad-shouldered and capable. Now she seemed almost fragile. I love Richard, she said when the judge asked her to explain her decisions. He's been good to me. He makes me feel less alone. Are you aware of his financial history? The judge asked. He's explained it to me. Those situations were complicated. Did he explain that he's been sued for financial elder abuse in 2 other states? My mother's face went pale. She looked at Richard, and I saw something flicker across her face. Doubt, maybe, or fear. I didn't know that, she said quietly. He didn't tell you? No, she said, and her voice was so small I could barely hear it. No, he didn't. And then something extraordinary happened. My mother looked at me for the first time since we'd walked into the courtroom. And I saw it. I saw her actually see me, as if she was waking up from a long sleep. The expression in her eyes shifted from defiance to something closer to confusion, followed by an awful, dawning realization. She sat back down very slowly. Richard leaned over and whispered something to her, but she pulled her arm away from him. It was a small gesture, almost imperceptible, but it was enough. Judge Morrison called for a recess. In his chambers off the record, he spoke to all of us. What he said was simple. He was going to recommend that the court appoint me as a conservator of my mother's finances, pending a review of all of Richard's transactions. If we could prove that he'd transferred funds without my mother's full understanding of what was happening, he would be ordered to return them. But here was the thing. The judge couldn't force my mother to leave Richard. He couldn't force her to accept help. All he could do was protect her assets and hope that, given time, she would come to her own conclusions. Sometimes, Judge Morrison said, the best thing we can do is give people room to change their minds. The hearing ended. Richard and his attorney left without speaking to anyone. My mother stood in the hallway, looking lost, like she didn't know which direction to walk. I approached her slowly, the way you'd approach a frightened animal. "Mom?" I said. She looked at me, and her eyes filled with tears. "I didn't know," she whispered. "I didn't know he'd done those things." I almost reached for her, but I didn't. I wasn't sure if she wanted that yet. "We can help you figure this out," I said carefully. "There's no rush. You don't have to decide anything today. But we're here." She nodded, but she didn't say anything else. Derek appeared at my side, and we both just stood there, waiting. Finally, she said, "I need to go home." "Do you want us to drive you?" Derek asked. "No," she said. Richard can drive me." But when she looked back toward the courtroom, Richard had already left. She was standing alone in the hallway, and for the first time in a year, she looked like she actually needed us.
The next 48 hours were the hardest of my life. My mother didn't call. We didn't call her. Patricia began the process of reviewing Richard's financial records with the court's authority to demand them. What she found was exactly what we'd suspected. Richard had transferred nearly $90,000 of my mother's assets into accounts that had no connection to her. He'd taken out the second mortgage and immediately moved that money as well. He'd been systematically liquidating her life savings and hiding it. When the court ordered him to account for the money, Richard's response was predictable. He claimed it was all joint investments, that my mother had agreed to it, that he'd been acting in her best interest. No one believed him. A warrant was issued for his arrest on charges of financial exploitation of an elderly person. He was picked up at a hotel in Columbus, where he'd apparently gone to wait out the legal storm.
His attorney immediately began negotiating a plea deal. But before any of that could be resolved, my mother called me.
"Michael," she said when I answered, "can you come over?" I drove to her house with my heart in my throat. I didn't know what I'd find. I didn't know if she'd changed her mind, if she was going to defend Richard, if she was going to ask me to drop the case. What I found was my mother sitting alone in her kitchen, a cup of tea in front of her that she wasn't drinking, looking like she'd aged 10 years in the past 48 hours. "I made a terrible mistake," she said without preamble. I pulled out a chair and sat down across from her. "I was lonely," she continued. "After your father died, after you kids grew up, I was so lonely. And Richard he was attentive. He made me feel like I mattered. And I wanted so badly to believe that someone could love me like that I didn't question it. I didn't question any of it." "Mom," I started, but she held up her hand. "Let me finish. I need to say this. I blamed you for being distant, but the truth is, I pushed you away. I pushed you away because you were trying to tell me the truth, and I didn't want to hear it.